that the formation of a curriculum is not based on the principles what are to be taught to the students. And that lack, are we supporting by saying that this knowledge is useless? Are we supporting that kind of, what is it? I say, lack of rigorous theoretical understanding that pins out here. Once I do a sociology course, it's a useful course for the sense that I'm presuming it, that it will allow me to look critically at caste. This is a useful thing. And do we not need such useful things? And that old rhetoric of being it usefulness is, I think, maybe.
All I'm saying really is that let's not be in a hurry to think that we already know what useful knowledge is. That's all I'm saying really. And in the industry that higher education has become, there is a premium now on selling saleability. Every educational institution wants to say that its graduates will get great jobs, that there will be a direct and immediate return in measurable material terms on the training you are receiving. Now this is a very short-sighted way of looking at things. That's all I'm saying really. So, what is useless? What is useful? These are things we don't know before the fact, so to speak. And in that sense, we have to be willing to play where we are not quite necessarily moving as though we are moving in a battlefield, but just playing with something. And that sense of play is as important and as pedagogically as fertile as any other, regimented, pre-planned way of producing a certain result like we have in training programs, where there's enormous research goes into how you say army recruits. How are they to be trained so that in X amount of time you will produce a human being who has these qualities. So where the idea is to do away with any kind of deviation, possible deviation from the plan. Now that may not be the best model. That's all really. So I'm not offering a definition of useless knowledge, nor am I saying that we should think that we have a definition of useful knowledge. Whenever we are in the presence of the need to think in terms of useful and useless, we should also have the courage and the training to be able to step back from it. Think about what are we talking about? Useful for whom, where, etc. That's all really means.
I often face. So bear with me while I read. The porosity of literature to accommodate the interdisciplinary humanities in evolving into a production of a new knowledge via amalgamation of progressive structures, taking recourse to a gradual growth than instant. How to respect this newness of identity while marginalizing the originality of its existence? What if evolvement is disturbed by dissent modernity into a complete breakaway from past? Is this a triumph of clarification and reason, or a maturity of aesthetics, or a destruction of unnecessary knowledge? What analyzation to fathom this query? What linguistic caliber can swear a reasonable proposition to this? What method of conviction do we adhere to succor a satisfactory offer? Does it get sacked by oblivion of non-knowledge? Second, archiving this old knowledge or this non-knowledge into bottles of new methodological direction. Can it be the advent of a new knowledge, all past shredded like phoenix? I can give examples of 4 examples like IA class, science students in arts, co-authors in an article or book or translation. Anyone can give the reply. I'll give you one example in a little bit explanatory way. The last IA class that I was under Dr. Brinda Bose, me and one of my friends, we were supposed to be in a team. what we did is that we read the essay and we are working with it with our own knowledge, whatever we had. But when the time came to amalgamate the knowledge that we have acquired and taken out in the output of a form of a paper, we were at a loss of words, like which one to discard, which one to take into it. Like we had an umbrella term, but even then we had this difficulty. Like if we lose some of the knowledge, like what we can do of that? Can you make it into a use in future? Can it be a new knowledge? Can it be given a new direction to make it useful in future? What about a English writer who has translated a Hindi poem into English? What words does he need to choose? Like we obviously know there is a million meanings to a single word. Which meaning to take? Which meaning to discard? I mean this is an existential crisis most of us face. So like, can you elucidate about it?
Very, very thought-provoking. So, yeah, I think this is a universal existential moment for everybody who is trying to grapple with what you call the new and to find language for it. Because logically, of course, one would think that the new should bring along with it its own language. Because the new, by its very nature, because it happens as if for the first time, should also auto-generate a certain idiom. The new would be an absolute idiom, but an absolute idiom would be untranslatable. No one would understand absolute idiom because you need some common ground, some sort of. So there, the existential question really arises: how to go. Same thing just now, Satish was saying that what to do now? What's the next step? Which word to use? Which to reject? What is the price to be paid for that? I think this is what you're saying. In the paper, in facing new concepts, new thoughts, and new synthesis. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I think this is a very, very real question, and precisely that is what I was also trying to address. So I was very tentatively suggesting that one works with the existing resources. Of course, one can always invent a language up to a point. You can make a new specialized language, which would be like a code. So sciences do that. Sciences often invent a program and a code, which slowly is transmitted to a small circle and then it expands and people come to know of it and so on and so forth. But with a certain sort of problem, like for instance, let's say poetry and literature, modernism, something like modern poetry, free verse as different from the structure of classical verse and so on. You cannot really invent a problem-neutral new language. That's not really possible. So you need to work with what is there as your existential resources. The existence of literature and your own relationship with it is the only material you have. That's why I think something like, I use this term forcing from philosophers and mathematicians, but it can be used in all spheres. Forcing. Now forcing is kind of violence to it. I don't deny it. There's a kind of violence to the word itself. You force something to violate its natural limits. I recognize it. But it is not an enforcement. It's not like a legal idea that you have a doctrine or a law which can be enforced through a police. So that, for instance, we, in the position of the teachers, can always enforce language. We have that power to enforce the language. So we can say that this is the concept which is suitable for this, and this is the discourse, and these are the propositional sequences which you must follow. And often, for reasons of one's own perverse pleasure, also for reasons of institutional economy, that is what we often do. We say, okay, you found a good problem, you got good data, but now insert yourself in the given proposition sequence and make something within that, make some new propositions out of it. That doesn't suffice, you're right. It doesn't suffice because the problem is far deeper and more serious. So there, something like a forcing becomes an interesting option. Because what forcing does is, it's a simple thing. You take simple elements or units of what you have. Say, for instance, in literature, you have modernism, modernity, modern poetry, free verse, things like that. And in contrast to that, you have classical values of poetry, which are types of verse, types of versification, types of meter, and things like that. So again, I mentioned Stephen Mallarmé, the poet. He says, something very interestingly, that between free verse and classical meter, there's something like, he uses a very beautiful word, simple word, perhaps. There is a perhaps. So modern poetry is not modern poetry in the absolute sense. Modern poetry is the perhaps of old poetry. You know, it's such a beautiful thing to say. You say that modern poetry is not what we think in a flash of militant sort of, as you said, absolute rejection of everything. That modern poetry is modern poetry, nothing to of the past. He says that modern poetry is the perhaps of the old poetry, the perhaps of meter, rather than free verse as an opposition to meter. Now, of course, you don't have to agree to it. You can take a position like Clement Greenberg and modernists and say, no, there is a clear break there. Something, whatever it is, but you get a point of entry to with that Mallarmé way of using perhaps. Because he uses that simple word, but it produces the new possibility of looking at it, which is neither continuity nor simple break. It's just an example. So, I mean, I took the example of Ambedkar. When he actually says, Buddhist, he writes a book, the book, in the sense of the book, which I started out with, Buddha and his Dhamma, then it's a question. Is this a book of Buddhism in the sense of history of Buddhism? Is it simply a new religion called Neo Buddhism, Ambedkar's Buddhism? But then why is it Buddhism? Why should someone? So it's a simple problem actually, but it's a very difficult problem. And it is a very coherent religion in terms of its following, its rules, its rituals, its yearly celebrations, everything, the symbolic apparatus is tremendous and so on and so forth. So again, I think in Ambedkar we can analyze this through this idea of the new. Not new which brings a new religion, but at the same time the new in religion. And I mean religious name here. I don't want to go into the what is Ambedkar idealism, that's a different question. But the new in the name. So these are simple examples of what I'm calling forcing. In science, of course, it becomes the most fascinating. Because that's when new languages can be apparently created. Mathematical language, formal language. But even in science, I think, there is an element of forcing, of the old and the perhaps. And yet, the perhaps has to also give the eventual decision. So new science has to come. A new revolution, scientific revolution has to come. But it cannot be completely separated from that perhaps either. So people like Galileo, even within Copernicus and Kepler, we know that the question of the shape of the actual the Earth, is it a circle, is it an ellipse, and all that. So all these things are moving with that perhaps or the forcing, which I think would be an interesting way of looking at language and the question of the name. So these are some simple examples.
Well, I'm not a specialist in literature, so I can't presume to suggest any way out to you, but it's, I thought I'd respond because this actually, you've articulated this so-called instance of existential crisis rather well, and in fact, many students of linguistics also face, as regards how to make sense of linguistic data. It becomes especially acute in the domain of stylistics, in particular, for any students who have to engage with let us say, particular linguistic configurations in poetry, as to how they should, what norma should be adopted. Okay, so the issue of norma comes up there as well. They come up in the domain of, especially when one is looking at, let us say, a literary text of course, I kind of, I found this